The desert had its own rhythm, and Astria Novak had learned to match it. Before dawn, when the air was still cool enough to breathe without choking on heat, she was already on the Apache flight line. Dust rose with each of her steps, clinging to her boots and the hems of her uniform. The helicopters loomed like predators in the half-light, lined up in perfect formation, their metal frames cold and waiting for the work she alone seemed to take seriously. Astria moved with quiet precision, checking every latch, every bolt, every connection. Her hands ran over missile mounts, as though she could feel flaws the machines themselves didn't know they had. Sweat gathered at her hairline, though the sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon. She kept her sleeves buttoned tight to her wrists, fabric damp with heat. No matter the temperature, no matter the season, her arms stayed covered. It was a small choice, but a deliberate one. 16 months on this base, and not once had she rolled her sleeves up like everyone else. The younger mechanics sometimes joked she was afraid of sunburn. Others thought she was rigid about uniform standards. No one guessed the truth. That was the point. She preferred to blend into the background, and it worked. Pilots walked past her with barely a glance, treating her as part of the scenery, the quiet airmen who loaded their weapons while they talked about tactics and swapped stories. Astria was the pair of hands that made their missions possible, but never the voice anyone heard. Her ritual was the only thing that gave her away. Each time she secured a missile or slotted ammunition into the belts, she whispered words no one else noticed. May they find their mark. May they protect our own. It wasn't superstition, not really. It was memory, a promise to names she never said aloud. The base was waking up behind her. Voices carried across the tarmac, rough with morning fatigue. Pilots arrived in their sunglasses and flight vests, walking with a swagger of men who believed the aircraft wouldn't dare lift off without them. "Yo, coffee girl." Lieutenant Ferris's voice cut through the dawn. He strolled toward her with his usual smirk, an empty cup in hand. Without slowing, he tossed it at her boots. The plastic bounced once and spun to a stop at her toes. "Make yourself useful," he said. "Get us refills before we burn up out there." Astria looked at the cup, then at him. Her face stayed neutral. "I'm not support staff, sir. I'm munitions." "Same difference," Ferris laughed, glancing at the others for approval. "Loading bullets isn't rocket science." Captain Thorne, older and more decorated, chuckled as he adjusted his vest. "Cut her some slack, Ferris. Someone's got to handle grunt work while we do the real fighting." Their laughter faded as they walked on, not a single one looking back at her. The cup remained where it had fallen. From the corner of her vision, Astria noticed Master Sergeant Wyndham leaning against the maintenance hangar doorway. The grizzled NCO had been in longer than most of these pilots had been alive. He gave her the smallest nod, almost invisible, but it carried more weight than anything else she'd heard that morning. Astria returned it with a flicker of acknowledgement before going back to her work. The weapon belts for the 30mm chain gun were heavy, awkward coils of destruction that could chew through anything in their path. Astria handled them as though they were extensions of herself, snapping connections into place without hesitation. She had been trained for this, yes, but there was something more in the way she worked, as if she wasn't just following procedure, but remembering it from experience far older than this assignment. "They giving you trouble again?" Wyndham's voice rasped from behind her. Astria didn't turn. "Nothing I can't handle, Sergeant." He said nothing else, but she felt his gaze linger, measuring. He had been watching her since the day she arrived, and she suspected he had guessed more about her than anyone else here. A clipboard slapped against her shoulder a few minutes later. Crew Chief Bellamy scowled at her, irritation written all over his face. "Novak, you loaded the Eastern Apache wrong. That mission needs asymmetric configuration." Astria glanced at the clipboard. The loadout matched exactly what she had already done. "Sir, the briefing called for 4 Hellfires and 2 rocket pods each." "I don't need a loader telling me how to do my job," Bellamy snapped. "Fix it. Now." Her jaw tightened. She nodded without argument and began stripping the load she had already completed. Wasting 20 minutes, she reloaded the weapons in exactly the same configuration. Bellamy's mistake, her punishment. She had learned long ago that correction wasn't worth the fight. The sky shifted from amber to burning gold as the sun crested the horizon. The heat thickened, wrapping the base in a suffocating blanket. Sweat trickled down her spine, but Astria worked on. At the edge of the flight line, the pilots clustered around their maps, voices rising and falling as they debated approach vectors. Astria caught pieces of their conversation while stacking ammunition crates. Captain Maddox's plan was to cut through the southern valley. Astria froze. She had seen the satellite images while prepping loads that morning. Heat signatures clustered near that very valley, tight formations that screamed anti-aircraft positions. The northern route was longer but safer. She knew it with certainty, the kind of certainty that came not from numbers, but from instincts sharpened in fire. She opened her mouth to speak, then shut it again. Nobody wanted the opinion of an ammunition loader. "Something on your mind, Airman?" Master Sergeant Wyndham again, arms folded, gaze steady. "No, sir. Just finishing the load." He studied her for a long beat. "Ever wonder why I requested you for my line, Novak?" She blinked, caught off guard. "I assumed it was random assignment, Sergeant." "Nothing random about it." He didn't elaborate, just nodded toward the pilots. "They're good, but not always good at seeing what's in front of them." Before she could ask what he meant, the base alarm blared. 3 sharp bursts that meant intelligence update. The mission briefing dissolved into chaos. Commanders and planners hurried to adjust strategies. Mechanics scrambled. Pilots cursed under their breath. Astria stayed steady, moving faster but never frantic. She pulled extra countermeasure flares from storage, integrating them into each Apache. No one asked her to. No one noticed, except Commander Riker. He emerged from the tent, barking orders, then stopped when he saw her. "Loader, these birds need combat-ready loadouts in 15 minutes." "Already done, sir," she said quietly. "Balanced for the revised parameters. Supplemental countermeasures installed." Riker froze, surprise flashing across his face. "How the hell did you know the revised parameters?" "Standard protocol," she said simply. "High-risk extraction requires additional countermeasures." The commander stared for a second longer before storming off, shaking his head. All around her, people stumbled under pressure. A mechanic dropped a wrench set, clattering like gunfire. A young private tangled an ammunition belt. A radio operator kept fumbling coordinates. Astria flowed among them, correcting errors quietly, her presence as subtle as the wind. When the private began to panic, she crouched beside him. 4 count in. Hold. 4 count out. Eyes on the horizon. He followed her breathing pattern, his panic easing. "How did you know that would help?" he asked, voice steadier. Astria just nodded and returned to her duties. Tactical breathing wasn't something ammunition loaders were supposed to know. But she wasn't really an ammunition loader. No one saw her fully yet. And that was exactly how she wanted it. By mid-morning the base was humming like an overworked engine. The Apaches loomed at full readiness, their rotors tethered but eager to spin, each one armed with enough firepower to level a small town. Heat shimmered off the tarmac in waves, the kind of dry suffocation that turned even the smallest movements into effort. Astria Novak worked as if none of it touched her. She checked the seals on fuel tanks, ran her hands along missile mounts, double-checked each connection. The motions were smooth, deliberate, and far too exact for someone who was supposed to be just another ammunition loader. From across the flight line, Captain Maddox watched her. At first, his attention wasn't deliberate. He was distracted, restless from the morning briefing, still debating routes and timetables in his head. But then he noticed her rhythm, the way she carried ammunition belts alone that usually required 2 people, the speed with which she moved through tasks, the sharp precision of her eyes scanning details others would miss. It wasn't just efficiency. It was familiarity. She didn't handle these weapons like someone trained from a manual. She handled them like someone who had depended on them in the field. Maddox frowned, trying to place the unease prickling in his mind. He told himself she was just competent, nothing more. Still, he found his gaze drifting back to her again and again, even as the pilots around him argued about routes. Inside the command tent, the noise escalated. The planners insisted the southern approach was the only option, shaving critical minutes from the extraction. Maddox argued it was suicide, pointing out the heat signatures that all but screamed ambush. He was frustrated enough to take the risk himself if it meant avoiding another pointless debate. Astria passed by with an ammunition crate balanced easily against her hip. Her voice was soft, almost casual. Bearing 030. Ridge approach keeps you below radar. There's a canyon system not marked on older charts. You'd make it clean. The words slipped out before she could stop them. As soon as they left her lips, Astria felt her stomach tighten. 16 months of silence, gone in a moment. The planner snapped his head around. Who asked you? His tone was sharp, brittle with stress. Maddox didn't answer. He was staring at her, really staring, as though seeing her for the first time. His eyes searched her face, her posture, her steady calm. How would an ammunition loader know about canyon systems, radar envelopes, and flight vectors? Astria cursed herself internally. She kept walking, disappearing behind the hangar before Maddox could press further. Her chest felt tight. She had promised herself she wouldn't slip. But the chaos, the rising voices, the flawed planning, it had tugged at instincts she thought she'd buried. By noon, the heat was brutal. Shadows shortened, and the air tasted of hot metal and sand. Ground crews moved slower, mechanics wiping sweat with oil-streaked rags, tempers fraying. Then it happened. One of the Apaches jolted violently during a systems check, the sudden movement knocking a ladder loose. The heavy metal frame crashed toward a young crewman frozen in its path. Before anyone could shout a warning, Astria was there. She crossed the 15 feet in a blur, pulling the man clear with one arm while catching the ladder with the other. The weight should have crushed her, should have taken 2 men to stabilize, but she managed it without hesitation. The crewmen gaped at her. Others stared openly. Maddox, halfway up the steps to his own cockpit, froze mid-stride. His eyes narrowed. That wasn't luck. That was training. Astria said nothing. She set the ladder aside, checked the shaken mechanic for injuries, then returned to her work as though nothing had happened. The whispers began almost immediately. Did you see how fast she moved? She caught that ladder like it was nothing. Since when does a munitions loader? Astria ignored them. Her sleeves stuck to her arms, but she didn't dare roll them up now. She could feel Maddox's eyes on her back. The mortar fire came not long after. At first, the dull thump in the distance barely registered. Then the shrieking whistle overhead sent men diving for cover. A shell landed near the perimeter, throwing up a plume of dirt and rock. The tarmac shook under her boots. Around her, airmen scrambled, covering their heads, shouting, tripping over each other in their rush for bunkers. Astria didn't move. She didn't even look up. Her hands kept working, locking the last of the ammunition belts in place. Only someone who had lived through bombardment before could stand like that, calm while the world erupted. Maddox saw it. His unease hardened into suspicion. He jumped down from his helicopter and strode across the flight line toward her, the ground still trembling from distant impacts. I want to check the missile sequence myself, he said, his tone clipped. Astria didn't flinch, didn't pause. She finished securing the latch before looking at him. Their eyes met for the briefest second, and Maddox saw something there that didn't belong to a junior airman. A depth he knew too well. Then the second barrage hit. This time the shell landed close. Too close. Concrete shattered, fragments spraying like knives across the ground. Maddox froze in the open, caught between instinct to run and training to drop. That hesitation would have killed him. Astria didn't hesitate. She moved. 3 strides, a tackle that knocked the breath out of him, and they rolled behind a barricade just as another explosion shook the flight line. Shrapnel tore the air where he had been standing. Stay down, Astria ordered, her voice low but commanding, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. Maddox obeyed before he realized he had. Confusion flickered across his face. Who was she? Then he saw her sleeve, torn from wrist to elbow in the roll. His breath caught. The scars beneath weren't random or accidental. They were patterned, unmistakable. Knife wounds, shrapnel burns, the distinctive starburst of a point-blank grenade. Scars that told a story only certain soldiers carried, and most of them hadn't lived to show it. Recognition hit him like a blow. He had seen these scars before, not on her, but in a classified debrief photo burned into his memory. "You're Echo 7, he whispered, voice barely audible above the ringing in his ears. Astria's eyes snapped to his, sharp and wary. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir." But her posture betrayed her, coiled, dangerous, ready to vanish or fight. Maddox shook his head in disbelief. 3 years ago, Operation Shadowfall. My team was cut off, surrounded. Command said extraction was impossible. But then 6 operators appeared out of nowhere, led by a woman with a voice I'll never forget. His words poured out now, unstoppable. "You carried my wounded. You killed 16 hostiles with a knife when your ammunition ran out. You dragged us through 3 miles of hell. They called you Echo 7, and they showed us one photo at debrief." He gestured to her arm. "These scars." The mortar fire faded into silence, leaving only the echo of his voice. Astria tugged her sleeve down, her eyes never leaving his. That person doesn't exist anymore. But Maddox knew, and in that moment, the cracks in her mask were too wide to ignore. The smoke from the last mortar strike drifted across the tarmac, acrid and heavy. Dust clung to every surface, muting the desert sun into a hazy glow. For a moment the base was eerily still, like the air itself was holding its breath. Captain Maddox leaned against the barricade, heart pounding, his mind replaying what he had just seen. Scars. Not the kind you get from accidents or training mishaps. The kind that spoke of fire and blood and survival against impossible odds. He had seen those scars in the Shadowfall debrief files. He had seen them on the arm of the woman who had saved his life. Echo 7. Astria's jaw tightened. She had spent 16 months perfecting the art of invisibility, crafting a life small enough to keep the past buried. Yet here she was, crouched beside Maddox, her cover shredded by one careless sleeve. "You're mistaken," she said at last, voice low and steady. "I'm no one but an ammunition specialist." Maddox shook his head, refusing to let it go. "No, I remember your voice. You barked orders like a hurricane while the rest of us were breaking apart. You led us through that canyon. You carried Rivera on your back when the rest of us couldn't even stand. Command said Echo 7 was classified, never to be discussed again. But I know it was you." Astria looked away, her eyes scanning the horizon where the smoke was thinning. Her silence was louder than denial. The all-clear siren wailed across the base. Personnel crept from bunkers and shelters, brushing dust from their uniforms, muttering to each other about the barrage. Mechanics checked for shrapnel damage. Pilots swore under their breath, rattled but trying to hide it. Maddox pushed himself upright, brushing grit from his vest. Then, without warning, he snapped to attention and saluted Astria. "Ma'am," he said, loud enough for nearby crew to hear. "It's an honor to serve with you." The words cut across the flight line like a blade. Heads turned. Tools paused mid-motion. A ripple of confusion spread as airmen glanced at each other. Why was a captain saluting a munitions loader? Astria's chest tightened. This was exactly what she had wanted to avoid. Master Sergeant Wyndham appeared from the hangar, his stride slow but purposeful. He looked at Maddox's salute, then at Astria. His weathered face carried no surprise. If anything, it looked like confirmation of something he had long suspected. "That's Lieutenant Colonel Novak," he said gruffly, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd. "The reason half our pilots made it home from Shadowfall." The reaction was immediate. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Some stared openly. Others tried to reconcile the woman they had dismissed as background with the legend they'd only heard in fragments of rumor. Commander Riker pushed through the cluster of personnel, face taut with disbelief. "Colonel Novak? The Echo 7? Why wasn't I informed we had a decorated officer on this base?" Astria's tone was quiet but firm. "Because I requested anonymity. And it's the Distinguished Service Cross, not the Medal of Honor." "Sir." Riker hesitated, thrown by her correction and the steel in her voice. She turned back toward the Apaches. With respect, these aircraft still need final checks. The mission hasn't changed. You can't just return to loading munitions, Maddox said sharply, stepping closer. Not after this. Astria leveled him with a look. That's exactly what I've been doing for 16 months, Captain. The crowd parted as Colonel Harrion approached. The base commander almost never set foot on the flight line, but the chaos had pulled him here. He scanned the faces, then fixed on Astria. His eyes were cold, assessing. Colonel Novak, he said, his tone leaving no room for denial. We'll speak in private. Astria exhaled, slow and resigned. After I finish my duties, sir. Your duties, Harrion repeated carefully, are whatever I determine them to be. And right now, I need you in the operations center. The crowd was silent as Astria removed her gloves and set them on the ammunition crate. She followed Harrion across the tarmac, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Behind her, the whispers grew louder. The operations bunker was dim and cool compared to the punishing sun outside. Maps glowed on digital displays. Radios hummed with background chatter. Harrion dismissed the staff until only Commander Riker, Captain Maddox, and Astria remained. He placed a tablet on the table. According to our files, you're Senior Airman Astria Novak, ammunition specialist. But we both know that's not the full truth. Astria sat, hands folded neatly on the table. It's the assignment I requested, sir. Riker leaned forward, incredulous. You requested to be downgraded to a loader after recovering from your wounds? That doesn't make sense. It made sense to me, Astria replied evenly. I needed a role without command responsibility. Ammunition is straightforward. Clear objectives. If I make a mistake, nobody dies. Harrion studied her in silence, then leaned back. And yet here we are, about to send 6 helicopters into hostile territory. A mission our intelligence now admits is far more dangerous than originally briefed. And suddenly, I discover one of the most decorated officers in special operations history is sitting on my base pretending to be invisible. He let the words hang before continuing. I need to know if you are capable of helping us. Not as a loader, as a tactician. Astria's gaze flickered to the wall display, where satellite imagery of the extraction zone pulsed with red heat signatures. She recognized the terrain instantly. I'm not here as a strategist, she said quietly. But you are one, Maddox interjected, stepping forward. You already proved it. You called the canyon approach before we even saw it on the maps. You knew about the radar envelope. You saved me out there without hesitation. That wasn't a loader. That was a commander. Astria clenched her jaw. Silence pressed in. The memories she had tried to bury clawed their way back. The canyon walls, the screams in her comms, the faces she couldn't save. Finally, she stood and walked to the display. With one gloved finger, she traced a line across the mountains. The Southern Valley is a trap. 3 anti-aircraft positions, minimum. They've had all night to prepare. If you go that way, you won't make it through. She shifted her hand. Here. A narrow canyon, 8 meters wide at its tightest point. Dangerous for a helicopter, but not impossible. It drops you above the extraction zone with minimal exposure. Riker's eyes narrowed. That canyon isn't on our charts. How do you know it exists? Because I've been there, Astria said simply. 3 years ago. Operation Shadowfall took place 12 kilometers northeast. We used this canyon to get our wounded out. The room went silent. Even Harrion's expression cracked, the weight of realization settling in. Then you know this terrain better than anyone on base, he said. Astria inclined her head once. Yes, sir. Within minutes, the mission briefing was rewritten. Pilots gathered in the operations tent, still unsettled, many stealing glances at Astria as she stood at the front beside Harrion. This is Lieutenant Colonel Novak, Harrion introduced, his tone clipped but formal. She has operational experience in this terrain. Her input will increase your chances of success. For the next 15 minutes, Astria walked them through the canyon approach. Her words were concise, calm, rooted in lived experience. She pointed out likely ambush points, recommended countermeasures, detailed maneuvers. The room hung on every word. When she finished, silence followed. Then Lieutenant Ferris, the same one who had called her coffee girl that morning, raised a hand awkwardly. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." His voice cracked with discomfort. "I didn't know." Astria looked at him steadily. "The mission is what matters, Lieutenant. Focus on bringing everyone home." Her words carried no anger, no satisfaction, just truth. For the first time in 16 months, the invisible loader was no longer invisible. The rotors woke the base before noon. 6 Apaches spun up in a rising roar that turned dust into a low brown cloud. Mechanics cleared the line. Medics staged at the edge of the tarmac. The air smelled like hot metal and kerosene. Astria Novak stood inside the operations bunker that faced the flight line. The room was cool and dim, filled with screens that painted the mountains in shades of gray and red. Colonel Harrion took the center position. Commander Riker worked the comms with a headset pressed to one ear. Captain Maddox's call sign lit the primary channel. The pilots were already strapped in, waiting on the word. Harrion nodded to Astria without flourish. "You briefed it. You sit here." She wanted to be on the far wall, out of view, but the stool that Riker rolled overstopped beside the main console. Astria sat anyway. She rested her hands on the edge of the table to keep them still. The canyon she had drawn on the map ran like a scar through the hills, a thin vein that promised survival if they flew it perfectly. "Raven Flight, this is base," Riker said. They had settled on Raven as the package call sign. "Cleared for takeoff. Proceed to Checkpoint Alpha. Report crossing." "1 copies," Maddox answered. "Raven 2 through 6, check in." Voices stacked in quick order, clipped and steady. Ferris on 2 sounded calmer than he looked earlier at the briefing. Thorne on 3 had the relaxed tone of someone who believed he could thread a helicopter through a mailbox. 4, 5, and 6 were newer pilots, good hands but not battle-seasoned. Astria listened for tremor and heard only readiness. The Apaches lifted in pairs, slid into formation, then banked low. The bunker screens caught them as green icons pushing north. Outside, the roar dimmed to a distant hum. Inside, the room felt tighter. Riker pointed at the terrain overlay. "Entrance to the canyon is here. You sure this cut is flyable for all 6? Astria kept her eyes on the contour lines. "It is tight at the throat. 8 meters at the narrowest, a little wider past the dogleg. Keep them nap of the earth and staggered. No overlap on rotors." Harrion glanced at her, then at the live feed. "Your call." She did not want it to be her call. She made it anyway. "Riker, push the ingress 2 clicks east before the descent. The thermal shows a heat pocket near the old mine road. Could be a picket." Riker relayed the change. There were no objections from the pilots. The trust had arrived in a single morning, as fast and violent as the mortar strike that had ripped off her sleeve. At Checkpoint Alpha, Maddox called the turn. The icons dipped toward the map's thin blue cut. Camera feed from one's nose sensor showed the canyon mouth, a black slit in pale rock. Shadows pooled there. The desert beyond looked flat and merciless. "Raven Flight, descend to 15 AGL," Maddox said, voice steady. "Maintain 50 knots. 2, hold 5 seconds behind me. 3, 10 behind 2. 4, 5, 6 follow at 5-second intervals. No stack-ups." Astria watched their altitude tape roll down. The canyon mouth swallowed one's camera. For a heartbeat, the feed went to rock wall and darkness. Then it leveled. The floor of the ravine appeared. Wind dust, lifted by rotor wash, streaked forward and vanished. "Base, this is 1. Inside the slot. Visibility good." Astria exhaled, slow and careful. "Riker, tell them to hug the right wall through the first bend. The left has loose rubble. Rotor wash will kick it into the tail." Riker passed it along. No one asked how she knew. 2 slipped in behind 1. Then 3. The screen panned with each nose cam as they followed the river of stone. The canyon rose steep on both sides, almost vertical, with a slice of sky so narrow it looked like a wire. They were flying inside a wound. Ferris's voice cracked once, then steadied. 2 inside. Tight, but clean. Harrion folded his arms. The room had gone very quiet. A text keyboard clacked and then stilled. Raven 4, Riker said, call position. 4 at the mouth. Entering now. Astria leaned toward the console. Tell them to expect a crosswind at the bend that looks like a blind wall. 30 degrees from the west. It pushes you toward the left. Counter early or you will scrape. Riker relayed. Seconds later, Thorne's feed showed the bend, a sheet of rock that seemed to end the world. Then he banked tight and slipped around it like he had done it 100 times. Nice and easy, Thorne said, more to himself than to anyone else. Halfway through the canyon, a small flare on the thermal image appeared near the rim. A pair of heat blooms that did not belong to rock. Spotters. Maybe rifles. Maybe a shoulder-fired missile waiting for a silhouette. Freeze that, Astria said. The tech grabbed the frame. Astria measured the angle with her eyes. Riker, tell one to hold off on flares. Stay cold. They do not have a lock unless someone pops above the lip. Maddox copied without comment. The feed kept moving. Astria felt each helicopter as weight behind her ribs. She saw the canyon as it had been 3 years earlier, smelled the dust and the copper taste of blood, heard the clipped radio calls that ended in static. She pressed her palms to the table to keep the noise in her head from getting louder. Raven flight exit in sight, Maddox called. Prepare to pop and push to the village. Astria clicked her mic to Riker before he could speak. On exit, stay low for 5 seconds. The ridgeline to the east has a line of sight into the open bowl. The village sits in a dead ground pocket. If you climb early, use silhouette. Harrion watched her instead of the screen now. Riker passed the instruction. The icon slid out of the canyon and flattened into the bowl, then skimmed along a shallow rise until the cluster of buildings appeared on the video feed. Pale walls. A few crooked alleys. 2 trucks and a rusted water tank. Shots flashed from a rooftop, wild and high. Contacts in the village, Ferris reported. Small arms. No vehicle-mounted weapons seen. Astria pointed to the left side of the map. There is an irrigation ditch here. It looks dry, but holds a lip. 1 and 2 mass behind it and use the chain guns for suppression. 3 and 4 hold hard left and watch the road approach for dust plumes. 5 and 6 land in the courtyard nearest the tank. Do not overfly the mosque dome. It will draw fire and you will not have cover. Riker pushed it all through. The room breathed again. On the screen, 1 and 2 flared behind the shallow ditch and let the chain gun speak. The sound did not carry into the bunker, but the image did. Dust kicked from the rooftop edges. Tracers arced wide. A figure ran and dropped his rifle. Another scrambled out of sight. Raven 5 on the ground, a young pilot said, breathless but precise. 6 touchdown. Civilians loaded. 2 children, 1 adult male, 1 adult female. Medical stable. 2 shift fire right, Astria said, almost under her breath. Your arc is drifting toward 5's landing zone. The gun drifted right like she had a hand on the stick. She felt Harrion glance at her again. She kept her eyes on the feed. A fresh thermal bloom spiked on the southern road. A truck engine warming just behind a berm. The roofline trembled slightly. Rockets, short tubes along the bed. 3, you have a technical spooling on the south approach, Riker said. Confirm. 3 sees it. Request rockets. Negative rockets inside the village, Astria said. Gun only. Aim low. You will throw fragments into the courtyard if you send a pod. Thorne did not argue. He rolled, placed a short burst right at the nose of the truck. The hood jumped, steam jetted, and a figure bailed out, unarmed and running hard. The engine died. 5 loaded, the young pilot said again. 6 loaded. Departing. Raven 1 pushed the route home, Maddox said. Everyone out. Same canyon, reverse order. Keep the spacing. The exit always takes longer than the entry. Astria felt it like a second heartbeat as the icons retraced the thin blue line. She watched the canyon mouth again, then the bend, then the shadow at the throat. The ridge spotters stayed put. No flare, no shot. The line of helicopters slid back into open desert like a string pulled from a needle. Base Raven 1, Maddox said. Package clear. All aircraft green. Returning. Only then did the bunker exhale. A tech hooped. Someone clapped a hand over his own grin as if he had forgotten how to do it. Riker took off his headset and rubbed his eyes. Harrion did not smile, but the stiffness left his shoulders. Astria's hands were still flat on the table. She kept her voice even. Have maintenance check 2's left skid strut. The camera showed a hard microsettle on landing. It will need a torque check. Riker blinked at her, then nodded. Copy. Harrion turned to face her fully. You just saved 6 aircraft and 4 civilians, Colonel. I made recommendations, Astria said. They flew the hard part. He studied her for a long moment. There was no triumph in her expression. There was relief, and an older thing that looked like grief that never quite settled. Debrief in 30, Harrion said to the room. Then to Astria, quieter. I want you in it. She started to rise, then paused. Sir, I need to secure remaining munitions and log the countermeasure draws. Riker frowned, surprised. Harrion did not. He seemed to understand that she needed to put her hands on something simple. He gave her a brief nod. 10 minutes. Then the debrief. Outside, the first Apache settled onto the pad. The rotors wound down, and the dust dropped back to Earth. Ground crews ran, medics lifted stretchers, and the rescued family huddled under shade they had not expected to see again. Maddox climbed from his cockpit and looked toward the bunker window, as if he could see through it. He raised a hand, not a salute, just a small acknowledgement. In the ammo bunker, the quiet felt like a different country. Rows of crates stood at attention. Astria pulled a ledger across the table and began to write. Serial numbers. Quantities. Flares expended. Belts issued and returned. Her handwriting was neat, purposeful, a record that proved cause and effect. If a pilot needed a weapon again tomorrow, it would work because she had touched it. The door creaked. Master Sergeant Wyndham leaned in, hat tucked under his arm. They made it, he said, no question in it. They did, she answered. He took in the ledger and the stillness and the way her jaw was set. The room in there will want to make you a legend. I would prefer not. He nodded. They will try anyway. I know, she said. I will do the debrief. Then I will finish the inventory. Wyndham's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Reluctant or not, ma'am, you led them today. She closed the ledger and stood. The weight in her chest felt familiar, like a pack she had carried for years and learned to shoulder without thinking. She did not want it back. She also could not deny what the map and the voices had required. In the corridor outside, the noise of celebration floated from the bunker. She walked toward it because that is where the next decision lived. The canyon would be on the maps by nightfall. The pilots would fly it again. And if they did, it would be because she had chosen to speak. Sometimes leadership is the last choice left when silence will cost lives. Astria could live with that. She could also live with rechecking the strut on Raven 2 before the sun went down. Both things were true, and both were hers. The debrief room was packed, louder than usual, though voices hushed when Astria entered. 16 months ago, she could have walked through this same space and gone unnoticed. Now every head turned, every gaze lingered, trying to reconcile the silent ammunition loader with the woman who had just navigated a flight of Apaches through Death's Canyon. Colonel Harrion gestured to the chair beside him, not the corner seat she used to stand behind. The pilots sat in the front row, their flight suits still streaked with dust. Captain Maddox leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his eyes steady on her. Lieutenant Ferris couldn't quite meet her gaze, fiddling with his flight gloves instead. Harrion started the meeting with the official report. Extraction successful. All 6 aircraft returned intact. For civilians, recovered. No casualties. Minimal damage to equipment. He let the words settle, heavy with the weight of what might have been. This mission was classified this morning as high risk, with projected losses of 50%. We walked away whole. The room was silent for a moment. Then Maddox spoke. Because of Colonel Novak. Astria shifted in her chair, uncomfortable in the center of attention. She wanted to redirect the credit, to point to Maddox's steady command or the pilot's flawless flying. But Harrion spoke before she could. Her tactical guidance prevented an ambush and ensured survival. Effective immediately, Colonel Novak will serve as Special Tactical Advisor for operations in this sector, in addition to her current assignment. A ripple of reaction swept the room. Some officers looked relieved, others stunned. Astria sat straighter, her jaw set. She had argued earlier for anonymity, for the simplicity of loading bombs and logging flares. Now her name and role were stamped in front of everyone. Ferris cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "about this morning, about the way I treated you before." Astria cut him off gently. "Lieutenant, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you flew your mission and brought everyone back. Learn from today. That's apology enough." The pilots nodded, one after another, quiet respect replacing the dismissal she had endured for months. That night, the base felt different. People didn't brush past her anymore. They stopped to greet her, to thank her, to offer small words they didn't know how to phrase. She responded politely, but inside she felt the weight pressing again, the weight of leadership, of eyes that looked to her for answers. In the mess hall, she sat at her usual corner table. This time, Captain Maddox carried his tray over and sat across from her without asking. "They've already named it," he said, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "Novak Pass. It'll be on the maps by tomorrow." Astria frowned. "That's unnecessary." "Maybe. But names stick. And it's not about pride. It's about giving pilots a landmark they trust. They'll remember it because they'll remember you." She looked down at her tray, untouched food cooling. "I didn't do it for recognition." "I know," Maddox said. "That's why it matters more." He let the silence stretch before leaning forward. "You could have let us walk into that valley. You could have stayed invisible. Why didn't you?" Astria's gaze lifted to meet his. "Because silence would have killed you. I've lived with the weight of decisions that cost lives. I won't add another if I can stop it." Maddox nodded slowly. "Then you're not just a loader anymore, whether you like it or not." She didn't answer. The truth was she wanted to be both. The simplicity of munitions grounded her. The complexity of strategy threatened to drag her back into a world she had sworn to leave. Days turned to weeks. The base adjusted quickly. The younger mechanics, who used to ignore her now, followed her instructions without hesitation. Pilots asked for her insight before missions, even when Harrion wasn't present. Commander Riker still scowled, but he stopped underestimating her. She still arrived at the ammunition bunker before dawn, sleeves buttoned, boots crunching on the gravel. She still whispered her quiet ritual with every missile she loaded. "May they find their mark. May they protect our own." But 3 days a week, she also stood in the operations tent, tracing lines across maps, identifying traps others didn't see, and lending hard-earned experience to missions that might have otherwise been disasters. It was a strange balance, a new equilibrium. One morning, Master Sergeant Wyndham joined her in the bunker. He leaned against a crate, arms crossed, watching her log the day's munitions. "You found a way," he said after a long silence. "A way to carry both, the past and the present. Not many manage that." Astria finished her entry, capped her pen, and looked at him. "I didn't choose it, Sergeant. The choice was made for me. Maybe. Or maybe you just stopped running long enough to realize you still had something to give." He gave her a nod, the same quiet gesture of respect he'd offered since her first day. Either way, the base is better for it. Later that week, a new order arrived from Central Command. A tactical advisory unit was being formed, and Harrion wanted her to lead it. The request came with fanfare and signatures and a message from General Conrad himself. Astria read it in silence, then folded the paper neatly. "Tell them I'll participate," she said, "but part-time. My assignment in munitions remains." Riker protested. Harrion tried to argue. She didn't bend. "Loading weapons saves lives too," she said simply. "And I won't abandon that." In the end, they agreed. She would split her time, half in the bunker, half in the operations tent. It was unorthodox, but so was she. The desert doesn't care for ranks or medals. It swallows everything in dust and silence. On one blistering afternoon, Astria walked the line of Apaches alone, her gloves dusted with grit, her sleeves dark with sweat. The aircraft gleamed dully in the sun, ready for another mission. Private Holly, the young mechanic she had once steadied during a panic, passed by and offered a crisp salute. Not mocking, not forced, genuine. Astria returned it with a nod. Captain Maddox came striding across the tarmac. "Briefing in 20, he called. Then softer, when he reached her, "I'm glad you're here. Both here, loading these, and there in the tent. We need both sides of you." Astria's gaze lingered on the Apaches, their rotors still, their weapons quiet for now. She felt the weight of the past pressing against the pull of the future. For the first time in years, the tension didn't feel unbearable. It felt balanced. "Maybe I need both sides too," she said. The sun burned high overhead, casting sharp shadows across the flight line. Astria Novak, once invisible, now stood where she belonged, in plain sight, both the quiet hands that loaded the weapons and the voice that guided their use. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that equilibrium was enough.